folks. My name is Jim Worthen. The show is Worthen One. We're here every day, Monday through Friday, 2 o'clock on channel 17 Cox Cable, and then at 7 o'clock in the evening. Besides that, you can go to TVSB's website, go to the demand side, go to the bottom, last Worthen One, and see the show. And you can go to YouTube and see the show. The reason for me talking about those two web sites is that our Channel 17 coverage is Carpinteria to Goleta. And there's almost never a guest that their discussion is limited to that area. For instance, my guest today is running for a state Senate seat that covers 2 counties. Maybe more, he'll tell me exactly because I'll screw it up. But so we're going to talk to the youngest man running right now, or maybe ever, for state Senate, Elijah Mack.
It's great to be on your show again, Jim.
Ever, or just now?
Well, that I know of, if elected, I would be the youngest state senator in California's history. I don't quite know if there's been someone in my age group who's run before, but I do know that if I won, I'd be the youngest.
Yeah. It's amazing. You would be 19?
Yep. When I take office, I'd barely be 20 by just like 3 or 4 days.
Yeah. First week in January of 25. It could happen. Everybody kind of laughs at the minority party candidates in a district, and this assembly, senate, and congressional district centered on the city of Santa Barbara and spread out is definitely a minority district. The other party has, I won't use their name because my family wash my mouth out with soap. Anyway, the other guys have about a 20% registration edge. And that's seldom overcome. I think in the last election there was one race out of the 180, about 100 legislative races that the person defeated a 20% edge. It was very unique. Had a lot to do with history and celebrity in that district. So, what got into your mind to decide to do this?
Yeah, so I've been very political from a young age. I don't quite remember when it all started, but I do remember I really started paying attention to politics around the 2012 election. So I was in 2nd grade at the time. And then when I was about 12 or 13 years old, I decided that as soon as I was 18, I wanted to run for office. And then I've always, growing up, I was that weird kid who used to watch like live streams of Congress and the state Senate. So I really wanted to go for a legislative position.
Yeah,
C-SPAN.
C-SPAN addict. Yeah. Mike, would you get our brief video up when it's ready? Go ahead. So you're watching in junior high school and elementary school and high school. How did you get along with teachers who thought they knew more than you?
Well, I didn't typically talk politics too much with my teachers. When I was in high school, part of the time I was homeschooled as well. So, I didn't really have to.
So you had great teachers.
Yeah. But that being said, I am today and used to be very interested in a lot of political simulations and things like, if you ever heard of it, like micronations. Just like, simulation governments are not too dissimilar to like back in the day when public schools used to have, your debate team, your UN team, things of that nature. And so that sort of transferred over, carried with me interest in political simulation and micronationalism and things like that. And so when I was about 18, I was sort of shopping around for offices I could potentially run for, particularly legislative ones. Initially, I wanted to go for state assembly, and so I started my campaign for state assembly almost 2 years ago now. And then over time, I got hooked up with the party I'm currently running with, and they didn't have someone in line for state senate, so I switched over from assembly to senate in my campaign.
It's better. It's a 4-year term. Yeah. Assembly, you're always running. Can we have that video, Mike?
Well, I've got some great news to share with you all in relation to my campaign to become California's youngest ever state senator. Last night's results in the March 5th primary were spectacular, considering that the general election is still a ways out, and I am currently in a deeply, deeply Democrat district. All things considered, about 38 to 40% was the absolute maximum I could have pulled in this primary, and I just made that range. The last candidate to run against Monique Limon did not fare so well in the primaries nor the general election. I also pulled more votes than all the non-Democrat candidates in neighboring District 17 combined. And while of course I didn't win this primary, I am confident that I am only going up from here. And lastly, from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank all 44,000 of you who voted for me. Every individual vote is an honor, because it means that someone out there trusts me to lead. And a lot of politicians take that trust for granted.
Very good. So you have faith in the voter. You have faith in our system. You're not one who says they're going to steal it from me.
No.
Well, I don't either, because they don't have to. We got to work harder.
Yeah.
So when did you make the final decision that you were switching to the Senate? Because Sari Rodriguez is our assembly candidate.
Yeah, so I decided to run for Senate around August last year, so almost about a year ago. So what happened was I was originally running this campaign. I wanted to run as either no party preference or libertarian, probably no party preference. But and many people in the local Republican Party reached out to me and they wanted to endorse me as no party preference. They felt that I had a better chance of going against Monique Limon. They felt that that possibly reflected my views a bit better. But things happen with parties, and they strongly prefer they have an individual with their label running. And so it was sort of came down to either I would run as a no party preference in the primaries, and the Republican Party would sort of have to pick someone to run against me. And going up against both parties in that sort of situation with little advance notice, I wouldn't have made it through the primaries.
Yeah, we had an example of that proof positive in the congressional race 4 years ago, where there was a young woman, very accomplished, and could have been a great congressperson, but she refused to take a party label. And so the party, under state law, is required to get a Republican for every office. And so they got a Republican. Salud was the Democrat, and the independent candidate got 7% of the vote.
Yeah.
Because the label speaks to the average person.
Yeah.
Sadly, so many people go into the polls and they haven't even heard the campaign. It's almost impossible for them to have heard every candidate, and they get in there and they see the party label and they're registered that way, so they vote that way.
Yeah.
So you decided to make sure that there wasn't a Republican running against you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have my own beliefs on various issues. While I'm registered Republican and I'm running Republican, deep down I don't really identify with a party. I identify with certain beliefs that I have. And if a party is willing to platform that, if a party likes my beliefs, I'm not going to, tactically speaking, I'd rather go with a party label and run and be able to get my ideas out there than lose in the primaries and be proclaiming my beliefs to nobody.
Right.
No, it's just better overall.
Well, it happens. So let's talk about your beliefs. Yeah. You came out of kindergarten as a libertarian.
Sort of, yeah.
And tell us what a libertarian is philosophically.
Yeah, so libertarian is sort of a very loaded term. A lot of people have different connotations surrounding it. People on the left tend to believe that a libertarian is just libertarianism is just a term that certain conservatives use to try to be more appealing, and certain people on the right think that libertarians are just like Democrats that are a bit more moderate. But libertarianism, I stick to the term, even though it has various connotations to different groups, because libertarianism really boils down to a very simple and I think a very agreeable political philosophy. And that is that every adult individual should be able to live their lives and operate their businesses however they see fit, as long as they do not directly affect or harm the body or property of other people, manipulate individuals like children, basically, live and let live as a political principle, and working towards a system wherein we work towards a society where everyone's free to live their lives however they see fit. As closely as we can, as closely as viable. So naturally, a libertarian's not going to be an anarchist, typically. They're going to advocate for some level of government, but that the government be limited to the best degree, the greatest degree effective for social safety and harmony.
Yeah, the Libertarian Party of 20 years ago, I think, got up to 5% of the population, and it isn't that the Republicans crushed them, it's that they took over a large segment of the Republican philosophy, and so they were absorbed into the Republican Party. You don't find many Republicans who disagree with your libertarian philosophy, do you?
Well, I do find quite a few out there, yeah. I mean, part of it comes down to there's a lot of connotations around the term, and they come at that thinking I believe certain things that I don't. And it's just a matter of discussing what I actually believe. But overall, yeah, definitely the Libertarian Party has definitely funneled a lot of people into the GOP. Particularly, the national GOP doesn't give libertarians a whole lot of power within the party, but especially on statewide levels, on local races, there's a lot of people who are running with the GOP who are a bit more libertarian, maybe a little bit more moderate, and they're adopted into the party, especially in states like California, where it's either Republican, the Republican minority, Republican super minority, which is the biggest second place power, or the Democrats. And if you don't want to stick with the Democrats, you have to go with the Republicans. And so, to a certain degree, I think the Republicans here can kind of be a bit more big tent as well.
So, let's give us the first reason. And you've alluded to it, but the first primary reason that you have a libertarian Republican philosophy.
Yeah. So in the past, I've worked with various political parties, primarily the Libertarian Party. I was a member for quite some time. I also was more loosely involved with the California Common Sense Party, which is now with the Forward Party, the Reform Party to a lesser degree, other organizations like that. And so I've come from a perspective where I, like many people, are very, very fed up with living under the rule of legislators who are bought and sold by private interests or looking to force some ideologue vision on everyone. And I come at that from a libertarian perspective with the belief that really the true purpose of legislators and the true purpose of political leadership, especially in the United States, according to our Constitution, according to our history, is for these legislators to try and put forth an environment wherein our economy, our communities, our environment, and our culture can survive and thrive on their own, organically, with as little dependence on or corruption by the government as possible. So I sort of want to work towards that system if elected and try to create an environment in California where we can survive and thrive organically. And that's sort of the underlying sentiment of my campaign that I feel like a lot of people out there do agree upon, Republican, Democrat, moderate, libertarian. I think in my campaign I tried to advocate for pragmatic principles. I like to believe that my campaign puts forth a platform of common ground ideals and common sense principles.
You mentioned the Constitution. I'm going to trick you. Where in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights is libertarianism laid out?
Yeah, so overall the sentiment our country was founded on is that you have a government for the people, by the people, based on the consent of the people, and that the role of the state ultimately is sort of to protect certain inalienable rights, certain objective rights, certain God-given rights, and these primarily are the rights to life, liberty, and property. And so these, naturally, if a system based on that is ultimately libertarianism. It's a system wherein individuals can live their lives and operate their businesses and their lifestyles however they see fit, as long as they're not directly affecting those of other people or legitimately harming the environment or things of that nature, because that ultimately affects other people. And so that's sort of the sentiment that this country was built on, is what I like to think of as the libertarian principle, so to speak.
You didn't fall for my trick, but I'll tell you. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution reserves all rights that aren't laid out specifically in our Constitution or Bill of Rights to the states, and then the libertarianism, the people thereof. And that's true libertarianism. The rights come down through the Constitution, Bill of Rights, through the states to the people thereof. So that was the trick, but you got it
I worked
more articulately.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So let's see. Let's go to capitalism.
Okay.
The raw power of the corporation and even though it's an invisible hand, it's in a mailed fist of steel crushing its opponents. So tell me how your philosophy fits pure capitalism.
Yeah, so as a libertarian, a lot of libertarians prefer the term free markets over capitalism, believe it or not, because capitalism is sort of a term that was defined by socialists. Some would argue that the term goes back to Marx or Proudhon. It sort of defines a system wherein the government or the state and other agencies work together with the capital-owning class to basically enforce their position oppressing the people, so to speak. So when we adopt the term capitalism, we adopt and sort of say, yes, that is the dynamic we're advocating for as capitalists, and that it doesn't really help us in debating those groups. So I like to use the term free markets in particular. And so my belief is that the free market is ultimately the environment wherein every individual can run their business however they see fit, can trade and share freely however they see fit, as long as they're not defrauding the customer, harming the customer, or legitimately harming the environment or things of that nature. And I believe that regardless of one's views on the free market or capitalism, you could be a communist and agree with this sentiment that I have, that ultimately the free market operates at its best when it's not being, when it's not being manipulated or corrupted by the government, so to speak, when there's not big government injecting itself into the free market, because then you get things like subsidies that give certain corporations an extra edge in the marketplace.
Thumbs on the scale.
Yep, thumbs on the scale, picking winners and losers, creating monopolies, protecting certain protecting certain private entities from the consequences of their own actions in terms of, lawsuits and things of that nature, allowing companies to sometimes exploit intellectual property laws to just give them a monopoly on crucial products immediately. When that sort of thing happens, you no longer have a free market. You have a market that's been corrupted by the state, and then you have things like, increased cost of living because, the main producers in the country are semi-monopolies or held up by the state. You have these big, massive corporations that, the little guy can't really keep up with. So my sentiment is I believe in advocating for truly free markets in the state. And if elected, I would try to shoot down and fight against any protection or extra benefit given to any private entities in the state of California that give them an artificial edge in the marketplace.
Well, it boggles my mind always to see how nothing is benefited by government interference. The free market adjusts itself right down to forming of unions and right down to boycotts and price cutting, out and out adjustments in the economy. I mentioned unions. How do you feel about unions?
Yeah, I believe that traditional unions in the United States were a big free market force for introducing a fair wage, better working environments. Although today many unions are to a degree in bed with the state. And then you get issues of these unions having, certain powers that don't typically exist in the free market that allow, when you have things like enforced mass unionization that ups the cost of production in a lot of fields, increasing the cost of living for everyone, artificially increasing wages, and then from there prices naturally increase, so you never really get that fair wage. You just get wages going up, prices just chasing after them, things of that nature. But in the traditional sense, I'm an advocate for traditional unions. I'm also an advocate for mutual aid societies, which are another organization that used to exist very predominantly in the United States before the existence of the welfare state. And in these organizations, workers or just everyday people would pitch in a common weekly or monthly fee. With that pot, they were able to cover everyone's. Effectively, they give them free health care, free stays in lodge hospitals, food for widows. They were able to build orphanages. I'm a member of the Independent Order of Oddfellows, which is a very old mutual aid society in the U.S. And they were one of the Oddfellows and the Catholic Church were sort of some of the big two builders of orphanages across the United States and things of that nature. So I believe that those organizations, mutual aid societies, as well as mutual funds for healthcare and things of that nature, really should come back in the United States. I feel like they're competitive. I feel like they're truly voluntary. They're organic products of the free market and just free individual cooperation. And I think to a degree they can work much better than a lot of these bloated, inefficient government services we currently rely on that sort of suck up our taxpayer dollars.
Well, I'm going to throw a line at you and see how you react to it. The government has allowed the family to not take care of its own. Now, is that true or not?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, personally, I believe that over time we've drifted into a system wherein, for a variety of cultural and economic reasons, the state is sort of, in one certain area, for example, sort of raising our children, so to speak. There's been an environment created where, families have to survive on 2 full-time incomes. And then where does that leave the children? They're going to be raised by the state and have the state's views and ideas impressed upon them, whether they be left-wing or right-wing. They're going to have, I'm personally an advocate to a degree for certain school choice initiatives and things of that nature, but ultimately I'd like to see a culture where we have enough prosperity that it can be normal again for, one head of household to work, and families can survive off of 1 full-time income, and the state will be less of a primary provider for certain families.
Well, that comes to the big question, taxes, because most all studies see that the second person in a household is the money is going to take care of the children that that person isn't taking care of, and to pay the taxes.
Yeah.
So it's, tell me, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, so taxation is a big burden on the average individual. I for sure felt it when I got my first check, when I started my first job when I was 15 and saw a good chunk carved off. The issue is we have to begin to get the right people in our state's legislature to start actively chipping away at the fat in our state government. The excessive expenses, some of them coming from choosing specific state-formed monopolies for a lot of our services and infrastructure in the country, in our state, who can sort of charge whatever they want for the U.S. government. The California government, almost everything the government does and almost everything it spends money on, they spend more money than they need to. It's inefficient. We need to get people in our legislature to try to rein that in, as well as to block and prevent unnecessary taxes coming in, unnecessary expenses, and try to reorient our economy to a situation where we don't necessarily need a lot of the things that the state government is paying for, where we can be our economy can organically flourish enough that a lot of the things we rely on in terms of social services and other things aren't necessarily as necessary.
So the big term in conservatism and libertarianism is privatization.
Yeah.
Tell me some government programs that could be privatized.
Well, speaking of mutual aid societies, and this is arguably not a form of privatization. Usually when people talk about privatization, they refer to it in sort of a negative light, talking about when the state takes an industry it runs and then gives it to one sort of state form of monopoly to operate, and the quality goes down from there. It's at least the narrative that's often pushed. But one area that I'd like to actually advocate for privatizing in a certain sense is actually advocating for mutual aid societies to redevelop and then sort of, in a certain sense, privatize certain social services we currently have, or on a local level, certain local expenses. For example, one of the pieces of legislation I'd like to put forward creates a system for city governments to work with local mutual aid societies to effectively hand off certain services to them. Just like if you've gone up and down the coast, you've maybe noticed there's a lot of small towns where, let's say, the Rotary Club builds the little local park or a certain public fixture, or helps fund a certain food bank or something of that nature. The city government can hand off those certain activities to a mutual aid society if they consent, possibly with a certain, maybe some state funds, hopefully less than the price of a state-run service in the first place. We can sort of privatize these certain services to mutual aid societies and build, these sorts of community organizations sort of taking on the role of government in certain fields. Other areas of privatization that are purely theoretical, some people talk about, one would say Amtrak is private, but some people are talking about privatizing railways. I suppose that's another California issue that's a bit complicated to just spill out right now. But I hope I gave a general idea of my idea of privatization compared to the typical sentiment around it.
Describe how mutual aid societies are formed.
Yeah. So these organizations are formed oftentimes informally or formally, where back in the day, traditionally, when most of these were founded, they often started out as sort of just groups of union workers meeting together at the bar every week and, pitching a certain tab to cover different expenses that family members
Farmers
had.
in the Grange.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Grange as well. And so I'd like to put forth a simple system where these organizations can be established through the state government. Not necessarily to regulate them, but just so that we have tabs on them and they have a formal, efficient way of getting put together. Local communities can just have a mutual aid society, or the city government can sort of start one on the side. But also we sort of need to reestablish and reinvigorate a lot of existing mutual aid societies. Like I mentioned, I'm a member of the Odd Fellows, and we've sort of been drifting away slowly just because of lack of membership into less of a true traditional mutual aid society and more of something like a Samaritan group, where we donate to this cause once in a while, we donate to this cause. But I'd like to see some organizations hopefully like fully taking on the traditional role of mutual aid societies, establishing mutual funds for healthcare for the members, things of that nature. There's also a possibility, a potential legislation I've been thinking of, and maybe I've talked about this with you before. I was having a conversation with some people at the Republican Club, and instead of having single-payer healthcare in the state of California, you could have an opt-in mutual fund for healthcare. Anyone in the state who wants to have their healthcare paid for or in part paid for can pitch in order to receive those benefits, pitch in a certain percentage of their income additionally, voluntarily. Or they can use private services or maybe the other services that the state provides. But they can pitch in voluntarily for that, and now individuals can pitch in for their healthcare fund in a way that's not adding to the tax burden on taxpayers, but it's also providing for the healthcare for the poor or individuals who otherwise need support in that area.
Okay, so when they pitch in, you just said something about the poor.
Yeah.
How do they don't have anything to pitch in?
Yeah, so there can be a certain range based on income for pitching into this organization. So individuals, you'll get down to a point where individuals can be recipients, but they don't have to pay. Now, then we'd have to get into the logistics of how much individuals who are opting in at the uppermost regions of the tax blockade, or how much they're paying in to, if it's going to be viable to cover all the people who want to, who are more on the bottom end of the spectrum and are applying without having to pitch in. But that's a whole other issue that would require some more prototyping of the system, and or maybe putting in place a system for individuals to apply for those benefits if they're looking to not pitch in but just to receive. So yeah.
Well, there's examples of this when you keep government out of it. Mutual insurance companies,
like that. Yeah.
And mutual water districts, mutual, that are run by the people and are to the benefit of those people, not some bureaucracy somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly like that.
Who was it? Napoleon, I think, said, take all the attorneys out and shoot them. I don't mean it, but maybe instead of attorneys, bureaucrats, take them all. No, go ahead. This mutualism, let's focus on, I think, the most important thing next to defense, and defense includes law enforcement, fire, and military, is education. How do we apply, it's become a slur in conservatism, how do we apply mutualism against the government school? The government school, which has failed people, particularly minority people. So we have to, when we say, oh, the wealthy can do it, we have to remember that it's our sacred duty to help the poor and minorities. So how do we apply that mutualism to that model?
Yeah, so absolutely. There are definitely theoretical ways where we could apply the mutual payment situation to schooling. I personally haven't thought out or fleshed out a real way to do that in the state of California, although you make a very good point. That's something I will now look into. We can apply it to healthcare, we can apply it to various other issues. But when it comes to schooling, currently I like the idea of school choice initiatives as a sort of, while that other idea is in development, we can focus on this. For individuals to be able to, families to be able to, if they choose not to send their kids to a private school, take the funds that would have been spent on their child as a student in the public school system and apply it to different schools. That would increase education competition. It would create more accessibility for low-income families to obtain education that may sometimes be better than that in a private school or more suiting to their children. Although school choice initiatives have often been referred to as Ponzi schemes or any other things by a lot of progressive politicians. But ultimately, their critiques come down to, well, individuals who would otherwise have their children in a private school are now receiving these benefits anyway, even though they already could afford private schooling. I'd say that there definitely could be caps at a certain income level. We could say that these school choice initiatives don't apply. But overall, I think it would definitely be a good way for your average middle income or low income family to be able to provide their children with education that suits them, and also increase the competition within our education system. And like I said, this would be taking the money that would already have been allotted to students anyway if they went to the public school system, and just giving that to a family, or just simply offering a large tax refund as well. So it's either money that the government was already going to spend, or money that already, in a certain sense, belongs to the taxpayer. So it's not necessarily, in certain systems, an increase in the tax burden. It's just a rearrangement that increases competition in education.
So there's two ends to this continuum. At the top, we have the Federal Education Department, the State Board of Education. Is any of that necessary, or would a libertarian conservative say the local school board is the model?
Yeah, so that is a loaded question when it comes to deconstructing the education system we currently have. But I will say this, I think as much of the power as possible should be brought to the community and their regional school. An issue is sometimes, just small communities can sometimes theoretically pick curriculum that's maybe out of line, whether it be a very, very progressive area, very, very conservative area, that can seep in by having too much control on a local level. Maybe to some degree curriculum can be decided on a larger district level or maybe a state level in certain situations. But otherwise, I really think that almost all the power should be down to the local school boards and local districting. I think that just sort of, as you were saying, 10th Amendment earlier, it increases the diversity of the representation of the views of the people and the interests of the people down to a local level, so that the interests of the local families can be expressed within their school.
I don't think public realizes that only about, depending on the area, 50 to 60% of education is in the government schools. Mm-hmm. There's 10%, sadly, and growing toward 20% of young people who have just fallen away. Mm-hmm. That really was accelerated by the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Kids that were going to be homeschooled on video by the government just disappeared from the system. Yeah. But 10% are homeschooled. Mm-hmm. 10% of the students. 10% are in Catholic schools, mm-hmm. and another 10%, I think that adds up to 100%, are in private schools. Mm-hmm. The money, though, goes from the top down through the education system to the public schools. Mm-hmm. How do we change that?
Yeah, gosh. So naturally, in any filter down system, when you have government agencies, the money's going to be pilfered off. It's going to be taken here and there. Yeah. Or it's just going to be, spent inefficiently at some level. And when it gets down to it, are you particularly asking about when it comes to funding school choice initiatives, where that money would come from?
Yeah.
So in a lot,
and maybe even supplementing homeschooling.
Yeah, definitely. Another qualifier can be made for homeschooling families getting some of that money, or maybe a tax refund for paying for a quality curriculum for homeschooling. I know some people have negative views of homeschooling. I was very happy being homeschooled. It allowed me to have a lot more autonomy in my education, allowed me to pursue a lot of things I personally wanted to do that I wouldn't have had time with traditional education. I still had plenty of friends. I've played in bands. It was a great experience.
Well, it didn't work. You're so stupid. And uneducated. Go ahead.
But yeah, so definitely a qualifier can be made for homeschooling families. But also, when it comes to the source of the funding, that's another issue that can depend on the theoretical system for a school choice initiative. A common suggestion is property tax in the state, which is similar to the system how that currently works in education funding for many states. I don't necessarily have my own personal advocacy for some particular system of acquiring those funds. I personally really like the issue of, first of all, just trying to, at the very least, get tax refunds for families that aren't going to be putting their children into public school systems currently. And therefore, the funding would just come from, a tax refund. But I don't have any particular system that I have fully fleshed out for funding in the state of California just yet.
Well, the founding fathers created a laboratory called the states. Arizona seems to be moving in a direction where the money goes to the student or for the student, and then the choice goes to the student and family on the type of schooling. And have you seen that, and does it look like there's big problems?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Except the
Sorry.
union.
No, gotcha. I see what you mean. I thought you were asking a more technical question about the sourcing for the funding. I don't see personally an issue with that system on paper. Just providing a certain stipend of money and saying pick which route you're going to go. If it's working fine with them. I personally haven't been catching up on Arizona's situation lately. I was back when they were starting to put the wheels in motion for their school choice system. But it sounds like it's working fine with them, and I think that system can be, tested. We could work on some potential prototyping for that and see how that would go. I like the simplicity of that option. Just here's the amount of money. Which system are you going to put that into?
So obviously you aren't the kind of local politician that says we have the answers here. You would look to Arkansas.
Yeah.
And you would look, as I say, to the laboratories that our founding fathers gave us in the states. The two outstanding ones really right now that I've seen are Arkansas and Arizona, where they're doing something completely different. But so you're open to that rather than we've got to do what the State Department of Education, we elect a state superintendent. Should we do away with that office?
Which office in particular?
The State Superintendent of Education.
That's
It's a statewide office, usually filled by bureaucrats who've come up through, although a state senator from here, Jack O'Connell, served 8 years as state superintendent of public instruction. Now he's a lobbyist in Sacramento.
Yeah, so that position, I'd probably have to do just a little bit more research just to make a definitive statement such as, absolutely, let's just abolish it and reallocate the powers, or just get rid of the powers to the local level. But overall, as a libertarian, my sentiment is always just cut out the middleman. Either it's a federal issue that should be established as federal, or a very, very local state issue. And all the middlemen and all the bureaucratic little rabbit holes that are run down from the state level to the local level should be chopped out. Just keep a clear, you know what I mean.
But, so you're not quite ready to go as far as Jim Worthen would with the French Revolution and say, off with their heads.
Well, not necessarily that I'm opposed to the idea, just that I think I am, in my mind, I currently have the arguments for that I agree with, but I just want to be like, make sure I don't, advocate for that and be like, oh, I was thinking about a certain district-wide office that does absolutely nothing that I wanted to get rid of. Oh, now I just said on public television that I want, yeah.
The second to education is our law enforcement process. And it's complicated by the money for or taken away from the police and fire and given to the social workers at the local level. And it's complicated by the judiciary. Describe how you feel about those entities.
Yeah, I think that we should definitely allocate more money to our law enforcement and our public safety agencies. A lot of the Democrats.
The real public safety.
Yeah, the real. Yeah.
Not the social worker who wants to be in public safety.
Yeah. I feel that a lot of Democrats in our state have talked a lot about, reforming the police and things of that nature, but they haven't really overall been talking about many reforms. They've been sort of talking about underfunding, rather, just underfunding our public safety rather than really reforming it. There's arguments to be made. We can have a discussion later on about things like qualified immunity or issues like that. But fundamentally, the Democrats, they're not about reforms. They're about underfunding public safety and sort of leaving us high and dry. So personally, I think we definitely need to provide proper funding for our law enforcement, our police agencies. Yeah, absolutely.
The judiciary, we have the benefit in California to at least vote on judges. Most are appointed, 80% or so, and sometimes there's an opening and a couple of attorneys fight over it. But we then, I think it's 6 years, Superior Court judges have to stand again. Would you feel that as a libertarian conservative that you should be involved in picking our judges?
Yeah, so in a certain sense, I'm sympathetic to sort of putting anything up to a democratic vote, so to speak. Although there is when it comes to, for example, how our national legislature works, some people would say that there's something unfair or undemocratic about our Senate being 2 senators per state. Even a state like Wyoming, who has 300,000 people, 1/3 of the people in my district in California, they get the same number of senators as California. There's something to be said about mixing up the variety of how representation works, because those 300 people in Wyoming may know something more about agricultural policy, to be general, than 1 million people in Los Angeles County. So there's something to be said about, and I believe the founders put a lot of thought into how they allocated power in this country. And so I'm not going to be so quick as to say, oh yeah, absolutely, let's put in term limits for judges on the state, national level. Let's have them all be elected rather than appointed, because I believe there's something to the idea of appointing judges. Term limits is another thing. I think in general, certain positions in our country, especially legislators, there needs to be term limits. Although the term limits often don't solve much when you have situations like here in California, our regime, Democrat leadership. If one Democrat terms out, they just pick up someone else they know in the local area, in the district.
Move from assembly to Senate.
They move assembly to Senate to Congress, but they'll just plop someone else in who's going to put forth the exact same policy. That even a lot of Democrats in this state are, they're not very fond of our regime leadership, but they keep voting him in just because partisan lines.
I probably will speak to it. I may let you say something, but we have a very stupid man who just suggested term limits on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was partially referencing that. Yeah.
Well, I guess he's president of the United States, but he doesn't know the Constitution.
Yeah.
And the Constitution has just one court. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many members, and then it gives the right of the legislature to do other courts as needed. Is there any need, whether he's stupid or not, is there any need to amend the section of the U.S. Constitution that has to do with judges?
In order to do what in particular? For the president
to take away their life tenure.
Oh yeah, I see.
To force sizes of courts and.
Yeah. So especially if it's the executive branch doing so, or the legislative branch, the issue is the last thing we need in this country is more activist judges, or more ideological judges, whether it be in our Supreme Court or down to the local level. And the issue is when you put that in the hands of an executive to pull out judges, bring in term limits and replace them, because it's ultimately the president that really makes that appointment. The issue is now you're going to get judges that reflect the president. If it was Joe Biden's choice, he'd put in some progressive judges in there. And so I don't think it should be up to, something where the president can establish term limits or interject and pull out their life tenures, things like that. Although there is an argument to be made that there are certain situations where you could have a Supreme Court that is full of ideological judges, and then what are you going to do? How are you going to get them out? But I believe it's a long discussion from there. But there are ways to deal with those situations, and I don't necessarily believe that what Joe Biden is advocating for is necessary.
We suffered that in the U.S. Supreme Court for about 30 years until the change in the presidency and the change in the court allowed 3 different judges from those who had run it for 30 years. I went to that area, but it applies to the state of California. I believe that the state Supreme Court justices stand for election. I think they do every 6 years. There was a gal named Rose Bird who had led the court in outlawing capital punishment, and she was voted out with 3 other judges. And so do you feel that there needs to be, for instance, in some states, all judges are elected, the Supreme Court stands. Do you feel that there needs to be more political involvement by the people in the judicial system?
Absolutely. I believe that it should be, especially when it comes to statewide judges and things of that nature, I believe it should be the people's choice who's appointed. Because again, we are dealing with a situation where in virtually every state we have judges who are effectively politicians in their own right. They have their own ideological leanings, and they're going to rule along the lines of those ideological leanings. And that's, to a degree, that's something that can't be avoided. So in those situations, the Supreme Court being a separate issue entirely, I absolutely believe that the statewide judges and things of that nature should be elected based on the consent of the people. Otherwise, being appointed by the state legislature or by our governor, that would be, we'd know that we'd get progressive Democrats, specifically the California regime Democrat flavor of progressive, being all of our statewide judges for, indefinitely, as long as we're stuck with them having a supermajority in our legislature.
I'm working down the chain of justice. District attorneys, they're county-wide district attorneys, which are really state officials elected in each county, have been elected by pouring in of money from the not just progressive, the ultra-progressive pro-criminal lobby, and they've won. Now, one was thrown out in San Francisco, one's about to be thrown out in LA. But how is society protected during the 2 to 4 years that the crazies had taken control?
I mean, that's just sort of the issue with democratic elections in general, because if said district attorneys or other judicial positions were appointed by executives in a certain county, it sort of just comes down to, well, if you have a conservative leadership in the county, the district attorney is going to be conservative. It's just going to reflect those partisan lines. And so I think the issue is primarily we need to have a political shift in the state. That's ultimately what's going to solve the issue of electing bad representatives, bad legislators, bad executives, bad judges. It's just the political environment. I don't think that can be solved by pulling the authority who appoints a certain individual from, democratic vote to another agency. Then that individual who's appointed will just reflect the views of whatever agency appoints them. So it just sort of comes down to, we need a sort of a new paradigm in our state's politics. And I'm not necessarily even saying we have to all just get on the board and vote Republican. What I'm saying is we need to have a movement in our state towards more sane, more practical politics. Like I was saying, ultimately, back earlier in this speech, we need to push for legislators who want to create an environment where our economy, our community, our ecosystems and our environment and our culture can survive and thrive organically with as little dependence on or corruption by the government as possible. That's the sort of mantra I'd like to see be carried through in our state's culture, not necessarily advocating for a certain party to just win the day, have a red wave or something of that nature, but just to reorient our voting habits in the state towards something a little bit more practical. And from there, we will receive, better elected officials in all levels of our state government.
It's ringing in my ears, and it's so strange. It's sort of like when they decided that red represented Republican and blue Democrat, when the Reds were the communists in the streets of Germany and Russia. Now the progressives are really institutionalizers, and the conservatives are kind of radical.
Yeah, in a certain sense.
And so as we come down this, and we are seeing it throughout the state, where district attorneys get elected by extreme amount of money from pro-criminal groups and pro-criminal individuals. And I'm not demeaning them, that's what they believe. They believe that we over-criminalize everything from shoplifting. They got us to make shoplifting $900 to murder.
Yeah.
And they want to, there's a reason somebody murders somebody, and we need to help them. Yeah, well, it used to be called the gas chamber. And I'm a bad person. The movement now is to reject those people. But again, and you're saying there's no way to overcome the fact that it takes a term. Sometimes it's 4 years, sometimes it's 6 years, for the society to correct its error.
Yeah. Unless there's a certain individual who can, cut that term short, who's of a different ideological view of the individuals whose term is cut short, I think that the issue is the ideology that permeates our state's culture and our state's government will just carry on no matter who's in charge. And one thing to note about the issue of, softening on violent crimes and things of that nature is the argument that a lot of Democrats put forth is that we don't have enough room in our prison systems, things of that nature, to fit the individuals that need to be released, so to speak. And what I find interesting is California is known outside of the state as a state with both a really bad quantity and quality of prisons. And yet our funding in our state is, I wouldn't say it's quite adequate for our prison system and our public safety. If the issue is that we don't have enough room in our prisons, or that our prisons are too cruel, well, let's reform the system, or let's pay to construct more room in prisons, create additions, create new prisons. The issue is to increase. The population of our state is increasing, our infrastructure needs to increase, our prisons need to increase alongside it. And that's something that I'd just like to note.
To tank your political career, and then that last 5 minutes, how do you feel about government unions?
Governments, gosh. Oh boy.
I was shocked that some district attorneys are represented by the Teamsters, and Jimmy Hoffa's rolling over wherever he is.
So I'm more of a fan of unions within the private sector, naturally. Although I do know there have been situations where unions within certain public sectors have been necessary when other areas of the local government really just gets in the way of another branch. Or I know there are some issues going on with our local teachers union because you may have heard about it. There was some housing propositions put forth for teachers, and that ultimately got reallocated, and something they were promised was ultimately taken away. In that situation, I think it does make sense for individuals who want to see that reestablished to band together and unionize. But I think in general, unionization is sort of a part of our right to free association. And I think it should be limited not on a pure principle, like there should never be government unions. But I think when a government union is going out of its way to create an issue or artificially, decrease the efficiency of government, increase prices, in that situation, then I believe that the state should be able to put its foot down. But otherwise, in general, as the principle, I think unionization, not necessarily talking about unions that are in bed with the state, just in the traditional sense of just a certain group of workers banding together, freedom of association, just pulling away from their work or unionizing to advocate for a certain policy within their institution. I think that should be open as a general rule until it goes out of its way to become an issue. Then it's a case-by-case sort of basis.
3 minutes. How do we answer the problem that government unions are negotiating with government and nobody's representing the taxpayer in those negotiations?
Oh, those particular situations that shouldn't be. And it ultimately should be either the legislator or the voter who is ultimately deciding anything in terms of payment or spending for the state government. It shouldn't be up to unions of public workers. I think it's quite simple. If it's an increase in the tax burden, it's a reallocation of funding. That should be legislators or voters, not unions or unelected officials or things of that nature.
2 minutes. How do you feel about tax issues being now submitted to the electorate in a general elections? Tax increases are how it's going to be spent.
Yeah, so I prefer that things like that are very transparent to the voter, what the tax increase is going to be, voting for it, to consent to or not to consent to it. Personally, I think a lot of taxes just are going towards certain branches of our state government or our federal government where it's just totally unnecessary and it shouldn't be on the ballot at all. But if it's going to be, I'd prefer that it's not just hidden up in Sacramento. It's in front of everyone. Personally, I'd like to see more of that laid out before the people. I also think that it should be significantly harder in our legislature to increase taxes or increase spending than it is to remove taxes and spending. As you may know, there's a push, or maybe it's already effectively in place in our state legislature, where if it takes sort of a simple majority to increase spending or institute a specific tax, takes a 2/3 or a supermajority to remove one.
1 minute. How can people help you?
Absolutely. So you can head to my website, www.mackforstatesenate.com, spelled FOR. You can check out my website. You can donate. I've got a lot of expenses coming up. I'm running a grassroots campaign, an underdog campaign. My opponent has 1.7 million on hand, and I have a few thousand. So just to compete with that, any and all funding would be greatly appreciated. And then also, just if anyone is interested in my campaign, likes my campaign, please just spread the word, tell your friends and family. Word of mouth, game of telephone can work.
And you're glad to talk to people.
Oh, absolutely. You can email me at elijahmackforcalifornia@gmail.com, and I can respond personally.
Thank you.
Thank you.